Jenny and Anna, if you want to go ahead and get started, we may have a few more attendees trickle in, but feel free to go ahead and start if you're ready.
All right, yes, that sounds great. So we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session, Professional Applications of Information Literacy, Helping Researchers Learn to Evaluate Journal Quality. We do have a Go link for this session, which I will now paste into the chat. And actually, I'm not pasting it, I'm typing it in case you hear me typing. I was trying to be slick, but I had to end up typing it out. Okay, so my name's Jenny Dale. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Information Literacy Coordinator at UNCG Libraries. This is my first time at the North Carolina Serials Conference, so I'm very excited to be here today. And I am joined by my fantastic colleague, Anna, who I will allow to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you, Jenny. I'm Anna Kraft. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm the coordinator of metadata services at the UNCG University Libraries, where I work with Jenny. I'm glad to be here at the NC Serials Conference. Thanks for having us today.
I am really enjoying how the Zoom transcription is reading NC Serials as like breakfast cereal. Okay, before we move forward, I'd like to go ahead and provide a land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered, which Anna and I are presenting today from Greensboro, North Carolina, has long served as the site of meeting and exchange for a number of indigenous peoples, specifically here, the Kiawe and the Saura. And we also want to acknowledge the sort of intertwining long history and legacies of settler colonialism and slavery on these lands, particularly here where we are in the American South. So today we are going to do quite a few things. We are going to define information literacy and lateral reading. We're going to make some connections between the information literacy skills we discuss and researcher needs. Look at some examples of predatory publishing solicitations and websites. Share resources to help you evaluate journal quality and answer your questions about evaluating publication quality. So that's where we're heading today. And we are going to start with my segment. Like I said, I'm the Information Literacy Coordinator, so this is really my jam here. I know that some of you are probably familiar with information literacy, but I always like to start with a definition, and the one that I typically use is from the Association of College and Research Libraries, and it is what you see here on the screen. Information literacy is the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So this definition is from the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. And with that in mind, I am going to ask you a quick question on a poll. So you can head either directly to the link that I am going to put in the chat, or type it yourself based on what you see on the screen. You see a link, a code, and also the option for a QR code. So if you have a QR enabled phone, you can just hold it up to the screen right now, go to that QR code, and this is a very quick poll about the ACRL framework. One question. It just gives me a sense of any experience that you may have had with that framework before. And actually, I'm looking at the attendees list. And I am seeing some folks here who I know have some experience with the framework, so I'm excited. Just give you about 30 seconds there, since it's just the one question. And I have made a critical error in my slide placement here. So let me get out of the full screen so I can get to my results. Okay. Ooh, I'm so excited. Look at this mix. So some people are not at all familiar. Some people have heard of it. Some people have some exposure to it. And there are at least 3 people here who are so familiar with it that they have a favorite frame. If you are one of those people, please feel free. I just realized I haven't been sending my links to all panelists and attendees, so I apologize. But if you are one of those people who has a favorite frame, please feel free to share it, and you can change your chat to all panelists and attendees so that we can all see it. Shannon, you are one of the people that I thought, oh, I've seen Shannon actually present on this before, so I know that she'll have something. Searching a strategic exploration from Sharon. I like, and both Shannon and Sharon here have used exclamation points to explain their excitement or sort of signify their excitement. And I love that. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. All right, so we'll head back. So there were at least a few folks who did not have much or any framework experience. So I am going to just quickly talk through the ACRL framework and just some sort of basics about it first. It's really focused in the higher education context, that's in the title. And what I have noticed over time working with the framework as an information literacy librarian is that even though it's not always explicit, the focus really is on the information literacy skills of students. And I often see that focus being more on undergraduate students. It was adopted in 2015, and it was set to replace the information literacy competency standards from 2000, which were a lot more sort of task-based, sort of skill-based, kind of checklisty. And this was really meant to be more flexible, and it is grounded in a lot of different educational theories and ideas, including threshold concepts theory, meta-literacy, metacognition, and the understanding by design, instructional design model. So this is how it's structured. There's an introduction, which is where the definition I provided earlier comes from, but it gives a lot of context for the actual document. And then the sort of meat of it is the 6 frames, and each frame has a sort of description or discussion section, a list of knowledge practices, which are kind of like student learning outcomes, but not exactly. And then dispositions for each frame. And if you're familiar with the framework, one thing you'll probably know is that this is one of the things that made it really unique. Dispositions bring in sort of affective, motivational dimensions of learning in ways that something like a competency standards list doesn't. And each of these frames, we can really think about them more like concepts, big sort of enduring concepts or enduring understandings, if you're familiar with the understanding by design model. And then they are supported at the end by 3 appendices. So this is our focus really for my section today, is to look more at these 6 frames. And here they are. And you will have heard 3 of them already in the chat. They may have gone to all panelists instead of all panelists and attendees. So Shannon's is authority is constructed and contextual, that first one. We also have information creation as a process. Then Sarah's favorite is information has value. We have research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and then Sharon's favorite, all S names. I like this. Sharon's favorite, searching is strategic exploration. And the framework and all the supporting documents are very clear to say that these are not presented in some kind of sort of linear order. They're presented alphabetically because they are interconnected sort of core concepts. It's not that you learn one and then you learn the next. There are a lot of intersections. So I am going to ask folks thinking about these frames and these ideas that you see on the screen. I'm going to ask you to just jump in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so and telling me which of these frames or concepts you think would connect with efforts to help researchers evaluate journal quality. And you can share your answer in the chat. I recommend changing it, unlike what I did, I recommend changing it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see. But in this sort of list of frames or ideas, where do we see any connections that we can make to these efforts that Anna and I are going to talk about today to help researchers evaluate the quality of journals? So I'll give you a moment if you'd like to share in the chat. Awesome. Okay, so look at these are great. So exciting. So I am seeing quite a few. I see authorities constructed, like who gives the journals legitimacy. I see all of them. I have to kind of agree with that. I think I could see connections with all of these. Scholarship as conversation came up twice. Authority is constructed and contextual. Great, these are awesome. Oh, interesting. Just an article from Nature about paper mills from Shannon there in the chat. So I do agree. I think we could probably make some connections with all of these frames, but I'm going to zoom and focus in on my personal favorite frame, which is authorities, constructed and contextual. And I pulled out these two knowledge practices from the framework. So the way that these knowledge practices are introduced in the framework is it says something like, in people who are in learners who are developing their information literate abilities go on and do these things. So they use research tools and indicators of authority to determine the credibility of sources, understanding the elements that might temper this credibility. So that goes back to what Sharon said about legitimacy, and then understand that many disciplines have well-acknowledged authorities in the sense of well-known scholars and publications that are widely considered standard. So these are, again, they're kind of student focused, but I think we can make a lot of connections to our sort of researchers, whether they're graduate students or faculty or other researchers we work with. And so one of the things that I've found in a literature review is an article by Tenopir et al. From 2016, where a survey was conducted. It was like international participation, over 3,600 researchers responded. And the whole purpose of the survey was to determine how these scholars and how these researchers determine the trustworthiness of scholarly information or scholarly publishing, and to determine whether or not that's changed as the scholarly communication landscape has changed. And overall, respondents really relied on some pretty traditional sort of standards of authority, what we would consider authority, and trustworthiness, like whether or not the journal is peer-reviewed was really the main thing that these respondents considered when either reading or finding scholarly information, just to sort of consume, and when seeking places for them to publish their own sort of scholarly work. And this pulls out that idea of that sort of traditional model here. So the authors say, even with all these sort of changes in the way that we disseminate our scholarly communication, the methods and criteria used to justify trustworthiness and quality remain surprisingly traditional. So in addition to looking for peer-reviewed sources, folks were also looking very much at sort of the actual content of the sources, which is something that I think most scholars are going to focus on, but also traditional criteria like journal ranking, even though, as they point out here in this quote, the researchers who identified that as an essential criterion still criticized it, talked about how problematic that was. So pulling more on that thread of this changing scholarly communication or scholarly publishing landscape, Swanberg and colleagues surveyed faculty at Oakland University, both medical school faculty and other cross-campus faculty, to try to figure out what gaps they might have in their knowledge about predatory OA journals and what their attitudes were about those journals. And so from a sort of framework, authorities constructed and contextual perspective, I'm really more interested in that first question, like what gaps in their knowledge exist. And overall, faculty expressed a range of confidence levels about assessing journal quality just across the board. I think it was about 25 or 30% ended up saying, yeah, I very strongly agree that I'm confident about this. But most people were sort of more, were a little shakier in terms of their confidence levels. And they were also asked what resources they would use to determine journal quality. And the top 3 responses that they got were their colleagues, Google or some other commercial search engine, or sort of professional listservs, websites, things like that. And I wanted to pull this out here. So they had these tools that they used to consider quality of a journal. And again, one was colleagues, number 1 was colleagues, and the next was to sort of do some general information searching. But what they really wanted in the survey, 71%, wanted a checklist that they could use that every time would say, yep, this journal is good. And the next sort of most popular thing that these folks at Oakland University wanted was more information on the library website. But these authors who also have done a lot of education on campus related to, journal legitimacy, like they say here, appraising journal legitimacy and quality, they were really focusing on trying to get researchers to really develop their critical thinking skills, to go beyond something like a checklist. And one of the ways that we can connect this all back to our authorities constructed and contextual frame is just seeing that we see a lot of the same kind of knowledge practices that are listed here reflected in the results of those surveys. One of the things that I teach a lot as an information literacy coordinator is this lateral reading, which is a flexible approach that helps with source evaluation. And as I was reading these studies, I was thinking, oh, lateral reading is something that they're sort of doing already, but that could also really supplement these ideas of them wanting to have a sort of checklist approach that they could really rely on to be right every time. And so lateral reading is a term that comes from the Stanford History Education Group, and its director and founder, Sam Weinberg, worked with a colleague, Sarah McGrew, a couple years ago and ended up publishing a 2019 article where they compared the online information evaluation skills of three different sort of internet users, three different groups of internet users: Stanford University undergrads, PhD holding historians, and professional fact checkers. And the fact checkers were by far the most efficient and effective at being able to evaluate information they were finding online because, as they say in the article, they employed a powerful heuristic for taking bearings, lateral reading. Fact checkers almost immediately opened up a series of new tabs on the horizontal axis of their browsers before fully reading the article. And typically when I teach this, I show a short video, but I don't think that we have time for that today. So I'll just summarize. This is a video from the Crash Course in Navigating Digital Information, and it features the young adult author, John Green. And what he does here is he distinguishes between lateral and vertical reading. And vertical reading, he says, is the way that we've really been taught to read websites. We go from the top to the bottom. We look at what they say about themselves. We look at their about page. We can ask ourselves sort of endless lists of questions about the content that's on the page. But we don't really get enough context to be able to evaluate a website unless we do lateral reading, unless we leave the page itself and see what others have said about it. And I think if we replace website with journal or publication information, we can see the same thing working really effectively for evaluating journals from a researcher standpoint. So not just looking at what the journal says about itself and just trusting that that's accurate, but actually going and sort of doing some of this lateral reading around the publication to understand what it is and what it does. And we do have these slides available. I'll put the link in again later. So if you really want to go back and watch that video clip, you sure can. Okay, so this is just a little bit more about lateral reading from Mike Caulfield. He's a big proponent of lateral reading. He's from the Washington State University, where he focuses on digital literacy. And he's just reinforcing some of the same points that we saw come across from that study. So one of the things that I would recommend, and that I do recommend for students that I work with, and that I would recommend for researchers, and I think you'll see in some of the activities that Anna shares, is that we can supplement more sort of checklist-based approaches with lateral reading. So you may be familiar with ThinkCheckSubmit. This was new to me, but I was looking through this and thinking, oh, this just is so perfect to think about in an information literacy context. So on this page, they do provide a checklist, a very sort of comprehensive, kind of like holistic checklist that asks a lot of questions. And this is how I, again, encourage students and other researchers to evaluate sources, to get in the habit of asking critical questions about the sources. And so this takes that same approach. But again, what I would encourage is sort of supplementing some of this with some lateral reading, going beyond just what you see on the journal site itself or the publisher site to be able to determine what else is being said about these things. So I wanted to use that to transition into Anna's section. And here we go.
Thank you, Jenny. All right. So Jenny's going to continue to run the slides, and we've got another very quick poll for y'all. Again, mentee.com. And it is just a very quick question to give us a little bit of context about your experience with predatory journals so far.
And I will give folks a few more seconds and then I will pull up our responses here.
Have you encountered journals or other publications that seemed like they might be predatory or questionable? Yes, yes. It sounds like everybody here who has responded has encountered these. And our researchers are encountering them too. So that's what we're going to talk about as we move forward. So y'all are definitely not alone in encountering these. Many academics receive these solicitations, and it seems like the more you publish, the more you're likely to receive them. So we are receiving them, our graduate students who are publishing, our faculty and others. And next slide, please. Thank you. So what makes a journal predatory? Let's talk through this now. So this is a definition I like that came from a recent comment piece in Nature. Predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and/or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. So a journal might be operating under all of these practices or just some. There are different levels of predatoriness, sadly. Next slide, please. And I do also want to acknowledge that the label predatory makes people uncomfortable. And it also really makes journals and publishers uncomfortable when they are labeled predatory, especially in public. So some people don't like this. And there may be a better term. There have been suggestions in the literature, there are conversations around this. Are there other words that we should be using? Maybe. But for our purposes today, I'm using the term predatory because that seems to be the most recognized and used term for this behavior, both in libraries and in other fields. Other fields are, of course, talking about this too. They don't come necessarily from the background of librarianship, but they are experiencing predatory journal behavior. So how do we know if a journal is predatory? There are a lot of indicators, and we talked through some of them in that definition that we saw. And these are some red flags. I'm not going to read them all, but they relate to some of those things that were on the ThinkCheckSubmit list that Jenny shared, and also that definition that we talked about. So there may not be quality control, there may not be peer review, even if the journal says it is peer reviewed. There may be very aggressive tactics relating to soliciting manuscripts and also to demanding payment. And then things that are not kosher in terms of listing people as parts of academic boards or editorial boards without their permission, or making up people to add to editorial boards. Next slide, please. And there are many more indicators. There are a lot of red flags out there, and some of them relate to impact or lack of impact, or information, misleading claims about various parts or aspects of the journal. So there are a lot of things that journals can do that are not transparent, not above board, and that might be indicators that they are not places that we want to publish. Next slide. So direct email solicitations are very common, and there's sort of a pattern. They often praise your work. They may include a citation of something that you have published recently. And they may offer you opportunities, perhaps to join an editorial board or to submit your work. But they may or may not have any contact or connection to what you're actually doing. So should you assume that any publication that directly contacts you is not one you want to be associated with? In my experience, most of the journals that have emailed me have been predatory, but not all. So I would have missed out on some opportunities if I was just across the board saying no to these. But we want to teach our researchers, our scholars, to be able to evaluate them. And I do want to note before we move forward that journal practices can change over time. They can get better, they can get worse, and you also see different individuals having different experiences with journals. So as we'll talk about as we get further into this, You may find that it can be very difficult to determine if a journal is yes, check, good, or no, definitely predatory. There are gray areas. And I know it's frustrating for us and for researchers because sometimes there's not a clear answer of this is good, this is bad, especially over time with things changing. So let's look at some quick examples. So on the next slide, this is a very recent solicitation that I got. This journal, for me, my perspective, doesn't need much evaluation. Current respiratory medicine reviews. I'm a librarian. I have no academic medical background. So they're looking for guest editors. I have no business being a guest editor for this journal. So I mean, I appreciated the opportunity to screenshot this email and share it with such a timely opportunity with this presentation coming up. But otherwise, like, this goes to my spam and I just delete it. On our next slide, we see another recent solicitation that I received that really does not need any evaluation. If you look in the lower right, decision on manuscript, 24 hours, publication time, 2 days. So there is no time in that window for any legitimate peer review or any kind of value add from the publisher. No copy editing, no layout, nothing. So we don't want to be publishing here. We don't want our researchers publishing here. But sadly, not all journals have these immediate glaring red flags. So it's not always this easy. And here's an example of a solicitation that I got a few years ago. And I want to look at this from the perspective of, say I'm a graduate student and I've just published my first paper. And this journal contacts me and they say, Dear Anna, I represent this editorial office. We have read your article. They cite my article. They think it's interesting. They want to invite me to join the editorial board. So this is personalized. It's more personalized than many predatory solicitations. And it does actually maybe kind of relate to my work, my area of work. So progress in human computer interaction, I guess, relates to libraries, at least kind of. So if I didn't know about this pattern and this sort of behavior, I, as a new researcher, might be inclined to email them back and say, I'd like to learn more. And let's look at the next one. So here is another, there's a very similar pattern. Again, this sounds like it could be a real journal, International Journal of Information and Communication Sciences. That sounds like a journal title, sure. It says, it shares ISSN numbers, says open access, peer review. Their publication turnaround is 50 to 90 days. So that's not like 2 days or 24 hours. That's a publication time that could be real. There are some red flags here. We have learned about your precious paper. Most academic journals are not going to use that language when they reach out to you. But maybe I'm not reading this quickly, or maybe I'm reading this quickly and I'm missing some of these things. So let's look at the website. Let's go to the next slide. And this on the face looks like it could be a real journal website. There are things here that I would look for: aims and scope, article processing charges. They have a tab about publication ethics. This seems like it could be real. On the next slide, we're not going to go super deep onto this one, but these are some of the red flags that I saw as I continued to evaluate that journal website and email communication. They contacted me in 2019. Their editor-in-chief was listed as stepping down in 2017. Who knows who's in charge of the journal, if anyone. There were some misspellings, some things that just didn't seem quite right. And I'm just doing this as an exercise of an example that I received. Our researchers, we hope, are evaluating these things in the same sorts of ways, but our researchers are not always coming from the background that we have in terms of learning about predatory behavior. So let's look at the next slide.
And Anna, I don't want to interrupt, but if I'm just going to give you a quick time warning, we're at 2:30, so just.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
So quickly, not all predatory journals show these immediate glaring red flags, and we're going to quickly walk through some of the resources that you can consult with lateral reading. So checking that email solicitation and reading the journal website, those are our first steps. But if you still can't tell, then it's time to do that lateral reading. And the first place that I would recommend that people start is their favorite search engine. So go to Google, go wherever you like to search. Don't just read about what the journal or publisher says about itself, read what others say about it. And I have had some good luck with challenging cases where I've just searched for the publisher name and the word predatory. And academics have a lot of information that they like to share that they put up in various places on the internet. You then, of course, have to evaluate the source that you find and are reading. But you can, think about things, determine who you're willing to believe and what parts of things you believe. Wikipedia can also be a good place to start. And there are some publisher pages that detail lots of sordid history related to scandals with peer review and other publisher behavior. So these are good starting points. This is more lateral talking, although it might be via email now, so perhaps lateral reading via email, but just talking to colleagues, advisors, mentors, others, seeing if they have experience. If you know someone on the journal's editorial board, I would encourage a researcher to reach out. If they find out that they reach out to someone who says, I've never heard of this journal, why am I listed? That's a really bad sign. The directory of open access journals can be a good starting point. And this actually can be a good starting point in terms of if I know I'm looking for an open access venue, maybe I'll start looking for it here. So inclusion in DOAJ is not a 100% yes, this is awesome and it's right for you criteria, but it's a good sign generally. And on the next slide, it shows some of the information that you can learn from DOAJ. So this is the page for the Journal of Learning Spaces, which is based at UNCG. And this tells us that the journal has no publication fees, no APCs, the license that they use for content, and a little bit of information about the publisher. There would be more on that page, but this is just a snapshot. Looking at the journal indexing is also something that one can do. Where does the journal say they're indexed? Is it actual legitimate scholarly indexes, or does it just say Google or ResearchGate versus somewhere you actually might want to look for scholarly content? And then, is the journal actually indexed? You might go to some of those indexes and check to see if you can find that content. There are also websites that track predatory journals. This is not generally a starting point or even necessarily something that I would mention with most researchers because it's important to have context with these sites. These are being created by individuals. We don't always know all of their criteria or how they and why they are constructing the lists, how old the information is. These are some things that have been helpful to me as a librarian over the years, but they're not necessarily places that I recommend for all researchers. But it's good to know that they exist. But even with all of those resources, evaluating journals can still be tricky. And we won't walk through these examples in detail, but I've got a couple of examples in here about some of the things that I would look for on some made up journals, like comparing different cases. And this one was for a new journal, where really a new journal, as you'll see on the next slide, those can be very difficult to evaluate because it takes time for journals to get established and to really get entrenched in their practices. So these are some questions that you can ask really of any journal, but that you might be thinking about, especially with new journals. And the next example is sort of a gray area. So a case where the journal is listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals, they were on Beall's list, they've had some scandals, someone I know is a guest editor, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. I might reach out to that acquaintance and perhaps find out more. So this is complicated and it can be time consuming. And there may not be a clear answer in some cases. So there have definitely been situations where I've found conflicting information online or read conflicting information from various accounts. People have positive experiences, people have negative experiences. And in these cases, you have to determine, or the researcher has to determine their own comfort level with the journal. So often in these challenging cases, what I'm doing is helping researchers say, like, identify, here are some positives, here are some negatives. Now you need to decide what is right in terms of you and your comfort for your scholarship. So I think that that is about the end of what we have. I wish that there were one silver bullet for saying, yes, this journal is great, or no, this journal is bad, but this is really tricky. So if y'all have tools and techniques that you use when working with researchers to learn about this, we would love to hear about it. Feel free to share in the chat. And we also are happy to take questions now if y'all have them. So thank you for being here, and thank you for taking this time with us today.
Thanks, Jenny and Anna, for that great presentation. So far, there are no questions in the chat. Folks might have been waiting though to the end to get started. I do have a question though, just out of curiosity. Thinking back specifically to talking about like the predatory journals and how it affects faculty too, not just your graduate students. Do you have much opportunity to educate faculty at UNCG about this kinds of stuff, or are you mostly working with the students there?
So I have done some webinars recently that have been open to the whole campus and that get attendance from some faculty and some graduate students about evaluating journal quality and about predatory journals. So there are some opportunities generally to reach out to everyone, but I find that most of the questions that I get directly are coming either from graduate students or from researcher pairs where it's a graduate student and a faculty advisor. And the graduate student market, for lack of a better term, is where I am getting more of these questions. I don't know if that's because faculty know better or because they don't know to reach out. It's hard to say. Jenny, have you had experiences in this area?
So I also serve as a liaison librarian to 5 different areas, and it's a mix of humanities and social sciences areas. And I feel like I've gotten maybe 1 or 2 questions about this in the past couple of years, one from a faculty member that I can remember and one from a graduate student. And fortunately, those were some of the sort of easier, sort of way too many red flags to ignore kind of thing. But I do know other liaisons in our libraries do get questions. I think the person I'm thinking about the most is one of our health science focused librarians. And I know that she has gotten questions from, again, primarily graduate students. But I think this is an interesting question because thinking back to, and I'll put the slides link in the chat and all our references and everything are in there. But that Swanberg article, this is something that faculty members really sort of expressed various comfort levels with, and that's of course at a different university. It's not us, but I would be willing to bet that faculty are actually sort of more confused about this than they might think they are, or less equipped to handle this kind of thing than they could be, especially with the sort of proliferation of these journals in recent years.
Yes.
Thanks. And we do have a couple of questions now in the chat. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but I'll go ahead and get started. So the first one is, has outreach by predatory journals increased or decreased in the past couple of years now that there's more information available to scholars and researchers? The questioner is asking if it's had an effect.
In my experience, I think there's more solicitation by predatory journals, just in terms of what I have been receiving personally based on when I publish. Every time I publish something very quickly, I'm getting these solicitations that follow that same pattern as we saw earlier with, we loved your article, we want you to publish. And I feel like I have been seeing, I haven't been doing scholarly communications work for super long at UNCG, but in the time that I have been doing this work, I have been seeing more of these requests coming. So either people are reaching out more, our faculty and students, or or they are getting more of these requests. But also we are trying to do more outreach about this and try to provide more education, because it really is unfortunate when people submit that work to a predatory journal and then they may not be able to get it back. So we want to give them get as much education as we can to them to try to avoid that happening.
Right. I think we really have time for one more. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded. We've got slides will go out with the recordings, and Jenny shared the slides in the chat. So if there's any other questions that we don't get to, definitely feel free to reach out to these two. But here's our last one. So this person noticed one of the sample emails soliciting submissions for predatory journal mentioned impact factor. What are the metrics you find the most useful when evaluating journals?
So any impact factor that is mentioned in one of those solicitations, I would immediately be skeptical of. And there are various impact factors out there, some of which are made up. Journals can kind of say whatever they want. So I am often not reaching the point with these predatory solicitations where we're looking at impact factor. We're finding red flags before we're looking at metrics. And metrics really come in more when we're looking at, we've found a quality journal, like how quality do you need it to be? Jenny, do you want to say anything about metrics that have helped you?
Sure. Yeah, I do, as a liaison, sometimes help faculty identify places to publish. And one of the things that I always find challenging there is the balance between like the sort of perfect publication scope wise and the higher impact factor publications that especially our pre-tenure faculty are really looking for to help sort of boost things. One thing I wanted to mention is that we had to give up Web of Science. It has to be 5 or 6 years ago now, if not more, because it was really increasing in price. And as a result, we lost journal citation reports. So we don't have access to that. That's a very commonly requested tool by our faculty. But we do, we have a subscription to Scopus, and we also use other sort of freely available tools for different sort of impact factors and other sort of altmetric approaches. So I am usually sort of, I'm like a humanist by training. So I'm usually sort of skeptical of numbers and metrics in that way, but I have tried to get more comfortable with using those sort of in concert with other things to help sort of encourage decision-making one way or another. But I don't have a like particular sort of metric that I often recommend to faculty or researchers.
Yeah, there are disciplinary factors that can affect that as well, for sure.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was a great presentation, and thanks to all the attendees. We'll have a 15-minute break, and then the final concurrent session will start at 3.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all. Great questions, and thank you for your participation.
Yes, thank you for those questions. And thank you, Christina, for helping moderate and manage the questions in the chat. We really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
All right, y'all.